You're listening to the Doctors In podcast from martinclinic.com. Although we share a lot of practical and, in our opinion, awesome information, what you hear on this podcast is not intended to diagnose, cure, treat, or prevent any disease. It's strictly for informational purposes. So enjoy. Hi, I'm Dr. Martin Jr.
I'm Dr. Martin Sr.
And this is the Doctors In podcast, and this is episode 163. And today we want to talk about a couple studies that have come out over the last few weeks, really, that have caught our attention. And it's really something that it's not surprising in any way. It's very reflective of what you would see everywhere you go. But the scary thing is you have a great analogy that you use all the time, talking about, we call it the carb roulette or the Russian roulette, right? A lot
You're
of movies
playing with a loaded gun.
Yeah,
right?
A lot of movies, you always see that one scene at some point where there's like a Russian roulette, right? They put one bullet in the gun and they spin the chamber. And
guy puts it to his head.
And he's trying to get information from somebody, so he's squeezing the trigger, and every time the trigger squeezes and there's no bullet, the guy gets really nervous and eventually starts talking, right? That's a pretty cliche way in a movie to get information from somebody. Just play Russian roulette with them, right? But anyways, you have this analogy that you use, and I find it's fascinating that if somebody has a lifetime habit of a high carbohydrate diet, they are playing Russian roulette.
Yep, absolutely.
Except for this time, rather than it being an empty chamber with just one bullet in it, there's pretty much every chamber is full. One bullet is cancer, another bullet is heart disease, another bullet is Alzheimer's or dementia, another bullet is diabetes.
Diabetes, absolutely.
And
the other bullet is premature aging.
Yeah.
The list goes on, autoimmune
disorders. So it's interesting that the only thing that you're going to know for sure is that you're going to get one of those things. You just don't know which one it is. And that's the interesting thing when it comes to having, we'll talk more about this in detail, but having a problem in that area, high circulating insulin, is that you will end up with something. It just depends on what you end up with, right? Some people can end up with any of those things, but the underlying cause for so many people is the same thing. So let's talk about the studies, and then let's explain why these studies matter. So the one that kind of caught our attention, that got us, you and I, talking about this off air, was a study showing that 12% of the population has normal values.
Only 12.
Only 12%. I'm not good in math, but that's not good.
That's 88% failure rate in some very, very important markers, right? I mean, the study was fascinating because it talked about metabolic markers. There was a book written years ago that was called Metabolic Syndrome, right? Or Metabolic...
I think it was called... Was it Syndrome X?
Syndrome X.
Syndrome X. I remember that book.
Yes, Syndrome X. Remember that? I think it was the first time that these researchers had coined this phrase, Syndrome X, which is really metabolic syndrome.
And the thing is this, metabolic syndrome would be better off if it was renamed. We've talked about this so many times in the years past in newsletters. Metabolic syndrome, it was a name that was given because of the way that it affects the whole body, right? Your whole metabolic system, your endocrine system, everything. But a better name, because they know the cause of it. Mm-hmm. It's not like we don't know the cause anymore. Yeah. So when you call it metabolic syndrome, you're not doing it a favor because you're not talking about what the cause of it is, which instead of metabolic syndrome, it really should be called high circulating insulin syndrome, right? It should be a high...
Because that's what causes it.
That's exactly what it is. I mean, the bottom line is that they have an insulin resistance or they have too much circulating insulin, and they get a syndrome. And, of course, a syndrome is they call it a syndrome rather than a disease because it can be characterized by a lot of different symptoms all over the place. So let's talk about that. 12% of the population has normal values of all these together: weight circumference, fasting blood sugar, blood pressure, triglycerides, and HDL. So let's go through those quickly. Okay. So only 12% of the population can say
they passed the test.
All those together, right? Some may say, well, okay, my weight circumference is good. My fasting blood sugar levels are good. My triglycerides are a little whatever, and my blood pressure is not bad, but my HDL, which is not where it should be, right? I mean, so 12% of the population can say, and those are really crucial markers of high circulating insulin, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of correlation with obviously your waist circumference, right? There's a ton of correlation between that and metabolic health.
Well, you always call the waist circumference a sugar belly, right?
Yeah.
It's
really a carb belly. It's a liver.
Yeah.
It's a
fatty liver.
And it also indicates for some people that their hormones are off, are messed up. So they're storing fat in places that they never used to store fat before. But the reality is that indicates a metabolic issue. There's no question when their waist circumference goes up, right? So that's a very important marker. It indicates for a lot of people high circulating insulin, or it indicates a problem with cortisol or a problem with estrogen or low testosterone for men. So it is interesting. You can't just look at an increased waist circumference and just nail it on one thing, because in order to do that, a lot of things under the scene has to happen, right? That's the problem. Is I find a lot of times we look at things a little too simply. For somebody to start putting fat there and start to increase their waist circumference, there's a lot of metabolic damage. There's a lot of inflammation going on behind the scenes that cause that, right? It's not as simple, which is why weight loss is so difficult because there's a lot going on under the hood, a lot of enzymes and inflammation, like we mentioned, right? So that's the first one. Fasting blood sugar is another such an important marker. A lot of times, by the time your fasting blood sugar levels are elevated, you've already had a metabolic issue for a long time.
For sure.
And this is because we've talked about this before, but it bears repeating. Blood glucose is toxic to you. Your body tightly regulates your blood glucose levels. You and I have talked about this before, that if you were to drain the body of all the blood, all the liters of blood that we have, and you were to filter out the glucose that's in there at any given time, you need about a half to a quarter of a teaspoon of glucose. Your body doesn't need much to function, and it's deadly. If your blood sugar levels go up too high, that's deadly. If it goes down too low, that could be deadly. Yeah. So your blood sugar levels are tightly regulated. Yeah. So in order to keep your blood sugar levels even or normal, your body will do a lot of things around it behind the scenes. Everything you eat gets basically converted into glucose, so it goes into your blood eventually. And if you don't burn it off for energy right away, you have to do something with it. You can't leave it in your blood. And that's where other hormones come in. Insulin gets secreted. Insulin takes that glucose out of your blood. And they call insulin a partitioning hormone. Basically, insulin tells glucose, all right, get out of here, and you're going into storage, right? You're not being burnt off for energy. So it's like, all right, let's go into storage. And, you have 3 places where you can store that. Your muscles, limited amount, but you have glycogen. Insulin tells your glucose, all right, go into storage, go into your muscles. A couple of chemical processes later, convert it into glycogen and store it in your muscle. And then, all right, muscle has a limited amount. Yeah. So then it's like, all right, liver is another place it sends it, but liver is even smaller. It's like a little carry-on suitcase that you bring onto an airplane.
I have just come back and, from flying. I just amazes me that people, what they try and get in that airplane on the little compartment, over your seat, right? Because they don't want to pay the baggage fee, so they bring these things in, these big wheels.
Well, I
get such a kick out of that.
We were away this weekend, and we flew back this weekend, and same thing. I like the look on their face when they know that they're pushing their luck, and they're like, oh, I've flown like this before, and I'm like, looking at the bag, I'm like, no, that's a full-size luggage. There's no way that you're
getting that in that little...
In fact, I was going through security in the customs, and a guy tried to get a suitcase through the thing. It wouldn't even fit through the scanning machine because he didn't want to check it in. So they actually made him leave the line, and it was a long line and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, you're right. I mean, it is funny. And, airlines, they're like, oh, yeah, we'll keep the prices down, but we'll just charge you for everything else behind the scenes. So people, they try to... The carry-on bags are getting a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger. But that's your liver. Your liver is a little small carry-on that you're trying to pack 2 weeks' worth of vacation into. And that's where liver fat comes in. And liver fat is one of the first steps towards diabetes. It's one of the first steps towards real metabolic issues, right? So imagine, you eat some food, it gets converted to glucose, and some things are broken down very quickly. We call them soon-to-be sugar carbs. They break down really fast. They spike your blood sugar levels, which is dangerous. So your body just says, nope, let's get that down.
Store.
Insulin comes along and it takes it and it says, all right, you're going into muscle's full. You're going into liver's full. Let's maybe pack a little bit around the liver, but not really. And then, all right, you're full. We got to get rid of it. Now you go into fat cells, right? And you can always make more fat cells. So,
and when it gets loaded up, it'll also release it as triglycerides into your bloodstream.
That's right. And that's what we'll get into the next one. And what's interesting, though, about what happens when you start to store things away. So now your body, fat storage is really just a way to keep your blood sugar levels stable. So you and I have said this before, is that your body's ability to store fat saves you from being diabetic.
Yeah.
Some people don't have the ability to store fat like other people, so they get to become diabetic much quicker.
Yeah.
They start to run into problems much sooner because they just can't store it like somebody else can, right? Somebody else can store on or pack on a lot of...
Yeah, because some people can be 300 pounds and haven't been officially diagnosed as a diabetic, right? Because their blood sugars are not...
Yeah, that's the only thing that's missing from the diagnosis.
Yeah. I mean, they really are,
Yes.
but there's numbers and they fit within those numbers, so they're told by their doctor, whatever, no, you might be but you're not. But they really are, and they're just fooling themselves, right?
And that's the thing, right?
They have a tremendous ability
to store
the glucose into fat, right?
That's right. And so that's what ends up happening there. And so now, over a period of time, your body will do this. But what happens after a while, it's like anything else, right? You've played a lot of sports. I've played a lot of sports. And you always have that coach who likes to yell. He's always yelling. He's always mad. He's always yelling. And at first, you listen. He yells. You snap into attention. You skate back into the circle or whatever. He's got your attention. But if he keeps on yelling over and over and over again, all of a sudden you're not as quick. You start to tune it out, right? That's not the most effective communication method, is just strictly yelling at somebody. People start to ignore the yeller. Well, that's what happens with insulin. So your cells have to respond to insulin. But eventually, if insulin is there all the time and it's always present and it's always yelling at them to do something, eventually your cells just say enough.
Yeah.
And they stop listening. So then insulin only is when it comes to that, is a one-trick pony. So all it does is it yells louder. So your body makes more insulin. So if you're not going to listen to this much, I'm going to make more. And then the cells listen again. And then eventually they say no. And then the body's like, all right, we'll make more insulin. And that's how you become insulin resistant. Your cells just stop listening to insulin, so your body makes more insulin. Your body makes more insulin. Your body, it increases, right? And then what happens after a while, you have insulin circulating all the time. And that's where problems start, because high circulating insulin causes all these things that we're talking about. It causes a ton of inflammation, right? For a lot of people that have a lot of conditions that started off as inflammation, that inflammation started off because they had high circulating insulin all the time.
It's the number one cause of it.
Absolutely. So now that's what we talked about. So, and what's interesting about fasting blood sugar levels, it's funny because in medicine they have a range. And if you're in that range, you're fine. If you're right before, like just say you're high, but you're not quite diabetic yet, they're like, yeah, you're pre-diabetic, or you have some other symptoms of diabetes, but you're not there. But what's interesting is that they've looked at the effect that these high normal blood sugar levels has on brain. Mm-hmm. It's not good.
It's not good. No.
High incidence of dementia and Alzheimer's.
Even though it's normal.
Even though it's normal, it's at the high end of normal, right? It's at the high end of normal, which is why still to this day, one of the biggest things that somebody can do for their health is just to cut down the sugars.
Yeah.
Right? Cut down the sugars and the soon-to-be sugar carbs. And it's amazing what that does to stabilize blood sugar levels.
It's like when they told you back in the 60s, when I was a kid, they finally found out that smoking was bad for you, right? Like my dad used to smoke 4 packs of cigarettes a day. And I remember he'd come home cold turkey. I think he'd read a study or somewhere or whatever. They said, hey, this causes cancer. In the 50s, they didn't think smoking caused cancer.
No, they actually would. I remember reading medical articles where if somebody has asthma, they recommended cigarettes. Which goes to show you again that science is never settled.
Yeah. They just didn't know.
That's right.
And it was like the food industry. the tobacco industry is well documented.
Yeah.
That they hid any kind of study.
Fake
that
science.
They bought off anybody they had to. It was a big business, right? But once people stopped smoking, they even cut it down. That's the only dent they ever made in heart disease and cancer. It never came because people changed their diet. People didn't ever change their diet because they were told not. They were actually, they changed their diet to bad eating.
Yeah,
because they replaced fat with carbohydrates and sugars. Right?
Yeah, which is and then all those fake vegetable oils and on and on. But so that's the issue with fasting blood glucose. So far, 12% have normal weight circumference, normal fasting blood sugar, normal blood pressure.
Blood pressure is huge, right?
Blood pressure, and it's the same thing. Again, we can go through a lot of studies here, and I got a couple I just want to, just on blood pressure, the importance of blood pressure. Much more likely to have a stroke if you have high blood pressure before the age of 40. And, it makes sense, right? Yeah. Because if you think about, if there's any problem in the endothelial cell wall, which is the inner layer of the blood vessel walls, inflammation in there, it's the walls that are the problem. It's not the buildup of cholesterol in them. It's the problem inside the thing. But you can imagine if there's any weakness in any of those things, when you have high blood pressure, it just exposes that tremendously, right? So blood pressure and stroke. So there was a study done looking at the incidence of blood pressure under the age of 40 and stroke later in life. And of course, it's high. And another one, same thing, high blood pressure in midlife high blood pressure. So, what do they consider midlife? Probably 30s, 40s, and 50s, probably midlife. Much, much higher incidence of dementia later in life. Again, which goes to show you the strong connection between insulin and dementia, because one of the side effects of high insulin is high blood pressure for a lot of people. It's not that that's the cause for everybody. But again, it's stress indirectly will raise your insulin levels because cortisol brings up your blood sugar levels and insulin has to get secreted. So, I mean, it's definitely all interconnected. But blood pressure is another one that's big. And we're hearing and seeing a lot more of people that have higher blood pressure, right? It's just people are stressed. People aren't unplugged ever. They're not thinking. They're not breathing. But regardless, they're not exercising. Yeah, they got deficiencies in magnesium. They got deficiencies in other things, vitamin D. And so all these kind of things, and it's causing elevated blood pressure. So that's another one. Triglycerides, as you mentioned, is a big one. Triglycerides is an indicator, in our opinion, which wouldn't even get you a cup of coffee at Tim Hortons. Yeah. You can't go there and say, hey, Dr. Martin, this is my opinion.
It's not good? There's no cash value?
No cash value. It's got less cash value than a Canadian Tire money. It's got no cash value whatsoever. But in our opinion,
and we're right.
We like to think we are. Triglyceride, I think I'm right all the time. Yeah. So that's true. Unfortunately, people around me don't think I'm right all the time. But triglycerides is just an indication of your carb tolerance at that point. Yeah. Somebody that has high triglycerides, they are eating beyond their carb tolerance. They're eating too many sugars, or they're eating too many processed carbohydrates, those crappy carbs, and it's causing a spillover effect into their triglycerides, as you've mentioned earlier. Just that.
Yeah, and there's no medication for triglycerides, and it's food.
Yes,
right. It really is food.
Food and depleting glycogen.
Yeah,
and we'll talk about that at the end. We'll go through that more at the end. So that's triglycerides. Now we talked blood pressure, and now HDL. HDL here is another thing as well, right? So what is HDL? Well, HDL is that high density. It's quote unquote that good cholesterol that's correlated with a few things. One being activity level is one, but that good cholesterol, again, is another. A lot of people don't have high HDL levels anymore. They really don't. You factor those things in, and 12% of the population only has normal on all those things we just mentioned.
Yeah, 88% failure rate.
88% failure rate. Now, if that was an institution or that was a board test, and 88% of the people were failing this thing, that you would have to look at the training. You would have to look at the information that people consumed to take that test was wrong, flat out wrong. That is an indictment on the system that people are being fed about their health, that people are being lied to about their health. They're given garbage information. So people are failing these tests massively because of that, because people don't know what healthy is anymore, right? We live in a time where everything around us is so polarized on one end or the other, right? You got it in politics. You got one end hates the other side's stupid. In the nutrition world, it's so crazy that just by telling people to lower your carbohydrates is considered a fad. It's considered a craziness, right? You got keto on one side, you got carnivores even further on that side. Then on the other end, you got vegans and vegetarians, and all that's doing is causing massive confusion, and all of them have some points to them in a sense that eat real food, right? And all of them can fail in any of those diets when they, you can eat keto and eat fake foods and have inflammation. Keto is not a magic bullet if you're not eating real food.
Yeah.
You can eat vegan and eat fake foods all day and eat processed foods, eat fake oils all day and have the same issues.
Yeah.
So there's so much misinformation out there. There's so much confusion, and everybody's fighting on nutrition, and the government and the guidelines are junk. They're just garbage. That food pyramid was bought and paid for by every lobby group that makes food anywhere on this planet, bought and paid for. Look at it. It's ridiculous, right? Yeah. So then what do we have now? 12% of the population is normal. 88% are failing this massively. And that's an indictment on everything around us. But the problem is it's causing some serious issues. It's, in my opinion, again, won't get you a cup of coffee at Tim Hortons. It's driving Alzheimer's and dementia.
Yeah.
It's driving it. It's creating inflammation in the brain. It's creating neuroinflammation. And you're seeing an epidemic of people that have absolute problems. Their body is outliving their brain. It's no use living to 85 if your brain lived to 72.
Yeah.
Makes no sense.
Yeah.
So all these things, we read these studies.
Serious implications. I mean, we could talk too, and, we don't want to get into politics, but, it's just some common sense when you look at, the country that we live in. And we're fortunate in Canada. We have a very good emergency care. Thank God nobody's left on the street, and you're in Canada. And you know what I mean? If you have a heart attack and you go to the hospital, and thank God, we do. I'm very thankful about that. But all the tea in China will not pay for the disaster. This is just a prediction. The disaster that we've created in the health care. Oh, yeah. Because we don't have health care. We have disease care.
Yeah, we have disease. We don't have disease care. We have disease management.
You got it.
It's a disease management system that all they want to do is manage your condition. Yeah. Can you imagine with type 2 diabetes, people can reverse it? And we're not saying that. This is not us saying this. Just go online and read. No. People reverse their diabetes. They get off their meds by eating a certain way, but that way is not talked about ever in any office, or it's just not talked about. But why is that? Yeah. Why is that acceptable? Why is that allowed? Yet,
you know what? How much a diabetic patient in a lifetime of, let's say, 20 years or 10 years of a diabetic, you're diabetic, and now you're a tax on the medical system because
I thought I read it was $250,000. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's $250,000 to $500,000
per person that gets diagnosed. That's you're
going to go to the hospital.
That's revenue.
You're going to go see your doctor. You're going to be, never mind what's coming out of your pocket in terms of, you need to monitor your blood sugars. It's like you said,
and then look at, even in Canada, they're talking about the cost. The story came out about inflation in food next year, and that the average Canadian is going to spend, I think it's $400 more a year on groceries, and it's because of the price of the real food is going up. Yeah. And it's just going to drive people again to eat real food substitutes. Yeah. But anyways, we could talk about this for a long time because the system is absolutely broken. And this study that we just talked about is the verdict. It's proof that it's not working, and a drastic. So basically, to me, it's just like simple. All right, what has everybody been doing to get to this failure rate, and how do we fix it now? All right, basically do the opposite. In my opinion, for a lot of these things, we don't move enough as humans. We sit down a lot, and I'm guilty of that myself. Work is sitting now, right?
My work is sitting.
Yeah, work is sitting. We don't have those movements like we used to have where we just walk around. We don't have that light sweat going at all during the day anymore. So we sit a lot. We're not exercising enough. We're stressed. People are stressed. And all these things.
You add stress into the mix.
Oh, it's an accelerator.
Wow.
And you and I talk about stress is biochemically and hormonally is an absolute accelerant. It will take any condition and just make it worse very quickly, right? So that's what's going on there as well. So, but anyway, so we covered a fair amount of stuff in this thing. Now, we have to just quickly talk about, so if the problem is high circulating insulin, well, then how do you correct high circulating insulin? And of course, the number one thing is food. It's food. It's, we talked, that. It's eating less carbs. It's eating less processed carbs. It's eating less junk food. That's first. Bring your insulin down that way. Naturally control your blood sugar levels so that you don't need as much insulin. Get less of a blood sugar spike. You need less insulin, and then correct the problem that way. Then you want to deplete. In my opinion, we have to start depleting more of our storage every day, right? After so many hours of fasting overnight, you start to burn off that liver glycogen. So intermittent fasting, get in the habit of mixing that into your routine to burn out those liver storage of glycogen. Go burn out the muscle glycogen. Go work out, lift heavy weights, go do high-intensity interval training. Do those things. Burn off that muscle glycogen. And then, again, start to burn off that fat for energy. But in order to do that, you have to fix a lot of hormonal stuff as well. People need their cortisol fixed. If they're estrogen dominant, they got problems with estrogen. If they got thyroid, their whole metabolism is running slower. So there's a lot of little things that has to be fixed there. But that's how you do it. That's how you reverse this. And it would be nice if this was adopted, and then down the road, these things are done. This study's done again, and more people are passing this. This is a wake-up call for people. And the problem is that, and we're all guilty of this, is because it doesn't affect us this very second, it's not on the front of our mind, right? It's not. It's something that affects us. Very few people in their 20s are worried about dementia, but people in their 60s are worried about dementia. The problem is that what they would have done in the 20s, 30s, and 40s and 50s would have prevented it. Now they got to work double time to fight off something that might be coming, right? It's the same thing with everything. We only start to worry about things as they become a problem. That's the downside. But
it ain't sexy.
It isn't.
We're not talking about talking about this ain't sexy.
No.
Now, the nice thing is we have an audience, and these people are very proactive.
Oh, no, and the fact that they're listening to podcasts like this.
We love you guys.
The number one
what you're
thing
doing.
that somebody needs to do is learn about their own human body and educate themselves, because the information they get from other sources or trusted sources are not necessarily the best for their health. All right, we want to thank you for listening. I know this has been a little longer than normal. We want to thank you for listening, and have a great day.
Thanks for listening to the Doctor Is In podcast from martinclinic.com. If you have any questions, you can reach us at info@martinclinic.com. If you're not a newsletter subscriber, you can head to our website and sign up for free. We also have a private Facebook group that you can join. It's a community of awesome people. Finally, I do a Facebook Live every Thursday morning at 8:30. Join us again next week for a new episode.